And I have to get over to speak on the nurses' motion, so it won't take too long, but I want to ask RTE a couple of questions first of all. In your submission you say that the topic of climate change will be a thematic priority in our news and current affairs coverage, and I'd just like to ask you if you could flesh that out a bit for us. I don't expect you to give me a thesis on it now, but for example, there's been a lot of talk about children and kids and young people and their awareness of this issue, which is greater than my generation and even the generation younger than me, and how they're playing a leading role forward. And there's been studies done that show how much children influence adults. You know, like the study about what kind of a car you buy is 60% influenced by what your kids say about cars, for example. That's a very well-known facts. And so the more we do to encourage children, the more it's going to impact on their parents and their aunties and the older generation. So there's a protest on this Saturday, despite what the previous deputy said about 12 people and a protest sounding like it's enormous in RTE. And it's a protest for children against climate change, and it's here at the Dail at 4 o'clock on Saturday. And I think that'd be a wonderful thing to cover it. And I haven't seen any coverage of it, but there's been a strike in Australia by school kids against coal mining and the coal being transported out of Australia through the barrier reef, which is already seriously damaged. There's been amazing speeches by that young woman in Sweden. I think that sort of thing should be like news items, and we should be covering that, because that will have an impact on kids, will have an impact on their parents. But I get what you say about your role, but then you go on to say there's no substitute for bespoke public information campaigning. And though I agree with that to an extent, I disagree, and a lot of it goes on here at the committee, that this is about just change in public behaviour and individual behaviour. There has to be much more about changing corporate behaviour, about what the oil companies do, what the coal industry does, what the gas industry does. And I don't see an attempt in a serious journalistic way by RTE to explore corporate behaviour in relation to climate change, and I think that should be something that you should really take on. You then go on to say that your broadcasting depends on actions that we take in terms of legislative change and attempts to change legislation. The bill I have before the Dail, which is quite controversial because it ended up in a limbo situation due to votes here at this committee before Christmas, at the Climate and Communications Committee, is a very interesting one because it challenges that oil and fossil fuel industry, and it says keep it in the ground, no more extraction or issuing of licences to extract fossil fuel from our coastal regions. RTE have barely covered it. And the times I've been on news programmes with Cormac O'Hara and others, I've got very little time to actually explain it. I don't accept that this is all about academic and science. If children understand it, we can grasp it. We just need to name it, and if we don't name it, then we're doing a disservice. And that brings me on to my questions to MET Eireann, because I note, Mr Moran, that you're a permanent representative to the World Meteorological Organisation, and you'll know that their recent report really names it. It really nails it when they talk about climate change being the problem in terms of extreme weather. And I think MET Eireann could do a lot more. I was very pleased to see in early January you did talk about human-induced climate change in the weather report. But all of your submission talks about weather and climate science. Are you reluctant to say climate change science? I'm sure you accept the science because you're part of the scientific community, but there shouldn't be a reluctance. And there was a report in the journal before Christmas that the staff were told not to link specific extreme weather events with climate change in MET Eireann. Now, I know it goes on to explain how one event isn't necessarily about climate change, that it has to be a series of events. But at this stage, can we not just name it and say there are a series of extreme weather events taking place because of climate change, and continually name it, insofar as we're trying to both educate the public but create a sense of that this is at the heart of what MET Eireann are trying to do, what RTE are trying to do, what the Oireachtas is trying to do, is to create public awareness, but to also say to the system this is not acceptable. That's just the questions I have. I hope they're a bit long, but I hope they can.
Well, okay, thank you. Will I start? First, or do you want to keep on?
To Mr Moran, because you seem to be a little bit defensive. The weather forecast is my favourite programme, both on the radio and on the telly. I absolutely love it. And I think you do a great job. But I'm talking about the language, and I don't mean it to sound like a semantic argument. Instead of just talking about climate, can we talk more about climate change and human-induced activity as a result of weather extremes? I've only heard it once on the weather forecast as human-induced activity being responsible for weather events. I just think we could up our game on that as a way of shaping the argument in the country, because I know loads of people love the weather forecast and watch it all the time and learn loads from it. So I don't mean to be objectionable to your role, absolutely not.
No, my only objective was to clarify the situation, and that we've had a long-standing position in relation to climate change. Thank you very much.
I think you've expressed it pretty.
And there's me thinking prime time was your favourite programme. But anyway, let me deal with the thematic issue. You know, the challenge for us, truthfully, is how we make the whole bigger than the sum of the parts. You know, we've evidenced quite a lot of what we're doing. The challenge for us is to bring it all together. And the Director General talked about how we aim to do one of our big picture weeks on this issue later this year. Last year, we began it by looking and addressing the issue of homelessness. Last spring, we looked at mental health. Just before Christmas, we looked at the place of women in Ireland in 2018. And the success of the big picture has been to reach out beyond the core news and current affairs programmes to engage, for example, 2FM in terms of mental health, to drama, to the orchestra, and how we actually harness the resources of RTE together to make the whole bigger than the sum of the parts is what we mean by the thematic issue. You talk about children. We're incredibly proud of News Today, which is our children's news programme that we run, and they have also done a lot in the realm of climate change. And I'm happy to take back the idea of the protest that you mentioned on Saturday, and I'll talk to my colleagues in the newsroom about it for this weekend.
Briefly, Mr. Moore. Oh, sorry, Mr. Walsh. Sorry.
Refer back to the article the Deputy drew our attention to in the Journal. In the WHO guidance regarding attribution of weather events, it says, you know, if you're asked a question like, did climate change cause a particular event, there's no simple yes or no answer to that. And the WHO says, well, that's a poorly phrased question. Now, you try and tell a journalist that essentially they've asked you the wrong question. You get nowhere. So we don't say yes, we don't say no, but we place it in the context of a warming planet and an increase in extremes, and that's how we do. Now, if you're being interviewed by a journalist and you say, well, we can't say yes, we can't say no, and they choose to write a headline saying, MET Eireann said no, well, that's the headline. We don't write the headlines.
Well, no, it was that your staff were told not to link climate change to specific weather events.
No, it was using the guidance from WHO. Okay. The advice to staff is you can't say yes and you can't say no, but you can place it in the context of a warming planet, and you can say things like these type of events are what we're likely to see and are part of the warming trend, but you can't specifically say in real time that this event was or wasn't due to climate change. You could say probability of it occurring is like a loaded dice. The probability of these events occurring has increased, but in real time certainly you can't say for sure that it was or that it wasn't. And if somebody chooses to say, they could quite easily have said MET Eireann told to link it or not link it. We were told to do neither actually, but place it in the context of the warming planet and the increased likelihood of these events.
Okay, and could I just ask RTE to answer my question about the coverage of the climate emergency bill on fossil fuel extraction? The ending of issuing licences?
Look, Deputy, there are many, you know, we don't only cover one issue, we cover a range of issues, but I'm happy to take that away. And
your coverage of these issues depends on our legislative action here.
Sure.
And that's a piece of legislation that's quite serious and that wasn't covered.
Okay.
When we come to the conclusion of this committee, the big debate is going to be around carbon tax. I'll probably be in a minority in opposition to it, but that doesn't mean that the people are not opposed to it. And I think that should be reflected, because we had the same problem in Parliament over water charges. There was hardly anyone in Parliament against it, but the people were against it. We saw the same in France in relation to carbon tax. So I just note that in your guidelines, you have to cover minority views. So I would think that that's a very important one.
Thank you, Deputy. I'm going to move on to Deputy Stanley.